Spacefarer. What the UFO? I'm here with Dr. Tania Searle. Tania, it's great to meet you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Very much. Pleasure is all mine. Introducing Tania Searle here. She is a PhD in sociology, a recent PhD. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And she's a sessional academic at the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Science and the College of Nursing and Health Sciences at Flinders University and also the University of South Australia. So congratulations on that. How's academia recently?
Academia is, I love the work, but like with a lot of, I think most industries, there's a casualisation of the workforce. It's really competitive to get a permanent position. So I'm chipping away at that.
And at the moment, you're teaching primarily sociology or different kinds of things in these different colleges?
I mostly teach Indigenous health or Aboriginal health, which is not so much about, because Aboriginal people in Australia have very poor health outcomes. And what we teach is not so much about the statistics and the types of conditions that Aboriginal people experience, but it's more about getting non-Aboriginal people to reflect on their own culture. So we reflect on ourselves and our history, and we teach cultural safety, which there's a whole movement throughout the health industry to try and change the culture of the health workforce, because there is a lot of racism towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. For example, there are examples, this is a little bit off topic, but it's not uncommon for an Aboriginal person to go to an emergency department in a hospital and get refused treatment. Yeah, so because of the stereotype that Aboriginal people are drunks and often use substances, that when people rock up to hospital, they're often viewed as drug seekers and that they're faking their symptoms to get drugs and then they're sent home.
Okay,
so
interesting.
Yeah,
that's heavy stuff. But you actually pointed us in a direction that we're going to go today, which is to examine some of the cross points between Western philosophy and Indigenous metaphysics. And just to lay people out a bit of a roadmap, we're going to talk about ontology first, and just like our understanding of the UFO phenomenon broadly. Then we're going to go into some of these your work in Indigenous knowledge and methodologies. And then we're going to get to personal experience and maybe some psi phenomena a little bit. So that's broadly speaking, those are our three main courses today. So I thought I'd start by just asking a little bit about your journey into the ontological side of the UFO question, and just set the table by asking you how you think about the UFO phenomenon in general. What are some of your priors, or what are some of your sort of rational structures that you bring to this conversation?
Yep. Oof. Where to start? For me personally, that question sounds like it's more about my personal journey leading into the ontology.
Okay.
So I'll take it there. When
I guess I'll just quickly side note that this is a brave moment for you to be talking about this. It's not something that you go around doing. You haven't done a dozen podcasts about UFOs.
No.
You work with the Visible College, which is how I found
Yes.
you. I've spoken to some other members of the Visible College, which is like a loose consortium of academics who are interested in advancing the public conversation around UAP. But even within that group, it's still a little unsettling to be crossing this line of having public conversations about it. And it is sort of the promise of the word visible in Visible College.
Yeah.
Which is why you get a lot of credit for doing this. And I just want to applaud you and thank you for that. And I want to flag for people that this is courageous. It's not like we're breaking down any doors and, breaking any news here, but sometimes just the act of having this kind of conversation takes guts. So thank you for doing that with me.
Thank you. So ontology, I guess I was like everyone else, living your life as you do. I think I'd always been a believer, but that's kind of like hope or faith, that there might be something out there. And I was always kind of curious and interested. But then comes that moment when you realise that there's something really weird going on and that phenomena is real. And then I made that shift from believing to knowing, which, was tricky, very tricky. And I love the title of your podcast because I spent several months walking around going, what the?
Yeah, that is definitely why we named it that way, because we felt overwhelmed and shocked.
Yeah.
So when you say you move from a place of belief or hope or interest to a place of knowing, what do you feel it's reasonable to say that we know about this subject right now?
Yes. So knowing is tricky as well because there's so much that we don't know and there's so much that we can't know. And I think that's something that I'll talk about with Indigenous knowledges as well, is that Indigenous peoples know that the human mind can't grasp things that are this big. So you just accept it. Whereas in the West, we're constantly trying to pinpoint exactly what it is. What is this thing? So for me, I now understand that there are craft that are intelligently controlled, that probably move between dimensions rather than, like traveling from planet to planet through space-time. And I think that's where a lot of our physicists get caught up, is because they're still thinking about the craft as a mode of transportation in the same way that we use transportation, and it's not that.
Interesting. Okay. Strong start.
So
we talked a little bit offline about this journey from a very nuts and bolts place to a wider, more metaphysically open space. Does that sound familiar to you? Is that how things kind of progressed in your own journey?
That's how it goes. Yeah. And from what I've seen amongst the Visible College members, and as reflected in that piece I wrote down, The Rabbit Hole, which is on the Visible College website, people seem to get to grips with the nuts and bolts stuff first. That's like the first tipping point where your ontology gets a bit scrambled. And then eventually, you go down a few layers and you land on the consciousness stuff. That seems to be the landing point for everybody. Yeah.
Let's talk about this phrase, ontological shock. Can you describe what that means to you and how you think it's playing out culturally around the subject of UAP?
So our ontology is kind of what we know and how we be in the world. So when what your ontological security is tipped up, then you experience a period of shock because your worldview has been tipped upside down. John Mack, I think, started using the term epistemological shock rather than ontological shock, which is a deeper level, because ontology is what we know and epistemology is how we know what we know. So I sometimes think that it should be more about epistemological shock, because it's much deeper, especially when you get down to the consciousness and the metaphysical stuff. Yeah, that it's a much deeper way of knowing the world, I think, once you get to grips with the phenomena, even though you still don't know what it is. But
that's really interesting. I've been casually using the phrase epistemological shock for myself to mean something kind of different, which is, in my way of thinking about it, the experience of noticing that our academic and other knowledge structures have failed to notice this extremely significant thing that it seems they should have told us about by now. So there's like there's like an earthquake of your trust in the systems of knowledge and of information discovery and delivery, and that I've been casually calling epistemological shock, but maybe that needs its own word, because it sounds like what you and what Mac are pointing to is as you say, a deeper shock relating to the ways in which we can know things in the world. And this is very dicey territory for Western academics to try to like very thinly explain how I understand this from a layman's perspective. People in the Western materialist traditions really don't like the idea of alternate ways of knowing. Like the traditional understanding is you can scientifically demonstrate something is true or you can't. And if you can't, then it is not knowable. And so the idea that there might be other ways of knowing, like direct transference of information to your soul from the cosmos, for example, is like extremely upsetting and destabilizing to that materialist paradigm. And I have to confess, I'm a little sympathetic with the project of maintaining a sort of objective, neutral viewpoint from which we can say things are true or not true. So I'm very curious about where you fall on this. And in researching your work a little bit, ChatGPT recommended that I ask you about pluralistic ontologies, such as like the idea that we can grapple with multiple visions of reality and maybe hold them simultaneously, even if they don't perfectly intersect. We're in very deep waters already. I'll throw it back to you to make sense of any of that. Did it ring positive bells at all?
Well, I used the term ontological pluralism in my thesis, because my thesis was about non-Indigenous people who work with Indigenous people in natural resource management. And because it's a colonial bureaucratic system, how do non-Indigenous people hand over decision-making power to Indigenous people so that they can practice their traditional responsibilities to care for the country. So I looked at two sites where that were working, where non-Indigenous people were, had significantly changed their attitudes and were trying really hard to hand over the decision-making to Indigenous people. So I wanted to capture what was working. And then a lot of my thesis, I looked at ontology and more so epistemology of the West and compared that to Indigenous epistemology. And so my Indigenous, that comparison is more like using Indigenous epistemology as a mirror to reflect back on ourselves, not to, like my thesis wasn't about investigating or analysing Indigenous epistemology. Like, that is what it is, and Indigenous peoples around the world have held on to their traditions. They've been the same. they've been saying the same thing to us for a really long time. And, they've always said the same thing since they've been invaded and colonised. So for non-Indigenous peoples, we have our own ontology. And then if we can not adopt Indigenous ontologies, but to understand that another group of people have a different way of thinking, and we can learn and understand that way of thinking and keep the two ontologies in mind at the same time.
It's so interesting, especially around the UAP area, because there are aspects of the phenomenon that challenge the materialist paradigm as it has so far existed. And I wonder if you think there are aspects of the phenomenon that are maybe literally impossible to understand or describe accurately within the classical, I keep saying Western philosophical paradigm, but I don't know if you use that phrase in Australia. Is that colloquial academic language all around the world?
Not really, but
you said non-Indigenous.
Same thing. Yeah. So I talked about Western epistemology in my thesis and Western science. So let's get into Western epistemology and ontology.
Great.
I'm really interested in what it means to be human.
Mm.
And in the West, we've constructed this idea around what it means to be human in a very particular way, which I think is tripping us up now when we're facing this phenomena and also questioning material reality. So if we go back to the Enlightenment, which was a shift from, there was a couple of revolutions. There was the Industrial Revolution, and then there were political revolutions, like the revolution in France, and then the American, what was it called? Your War of Independence from Britain.
Yeah, we also call it the American Revolution.
The American Revolution, yeah. So they were all going on at the same time, and then science was being born around that time, and there was a move to shift away from the rule of kings to the rule of men, so that we no longer had a monarchy who was governing and acting as sovereign, but we now have a democracy. And with science, there was a shift from superstition to rationalism. So there was a big, a really big move to not engage in superstition at all, and that it has to be this scientific method that investigates material reality.
And that, just to quickly interject, that also sounds like a political break from the church as it had existed in historic Europe, which like made the rules and killed scientists who disagreed. So to transcend that old paradigm and say, no, from now on, the rationalists are going to figure out what's right, and we're not going to just like pass down what God said from, a piece of paper somebody wrote 2,000 years ago. This seems important and like a good project. And many of us in what you would loosely call the West are raised to think that this was basically the best thing that has happened in human history, and like an extremely important forward step in the realm of thought and politics.
Yep. So there used to be, there always has been through religion, a hierarchy constructed around life on Earth, where humans are positioned at the top. Like there was once a theory called the Great Chain of Being. This was before the Enlightenment, where you have God and then you have kings and priests and, and people are ranked from top to bottom, from the most important to the least important. And then that kind of transferred over in the Enlightenment, but it was it stems back to Darwin's theory of evolution. Got revolution on my mind. So Darwin's theory of evolution, saying that we evolved from primates and what have you. And then social Darwinism piggybacked off that idea and said that humans as a species keep evolving, and the most evolved, most superior, most intelligent, most moral form of human being was the white man.
Right. Sort of kind of proposing that successful modes of culture as described by like physical domination of the world are therefore better in some way.
Yeah.
So you could make an argument that if a culture overcomes another culture, as colonial cultures did to indigenous cultures, that it had some sort of like moral rectitude behind it, that this was like the way of nature.
Yeah. And that's white supremacy, that white people are, the idea that white people are better or are the most evolved form of human. Yeah. And there's, even though that idea, because the idea was that different races had not only different physical characteristics, but those physical characteristics were a reflection of your intelligence and your morality.
Mm-hmm.
So only white people were assigned both intelligence and morality. And then you have people in the middle who have a mixture of both. And then Aboriginal people were positioned at the very bottom as the missing link between apes and humans. So they weren't considered to be human for a long time, which remains an issue. And then even though that science has been debunked, like with genetics and DNA, you can't test for race. Like there is no gene that says you're this race and therefore your level of intelligence and morality is this. You can use DNA testing to group people according to their physical characteristics, which are generally associated with regions, and the physical characteristics are associated with climate. So that positioning, and during the Enlightenment, when democracy was born, it was only property-owning white men who could vote. Mm-hmm. So they were positioned as the rational ones that could use their intelligence to sum up, weigh out the options and then make a decision. Because other people weren't granted that level of intelligence, including women at the time.
So the project of the Enlightenment may have represented in many ways a major step up morally and intellectually from previous versions of humanity, but it definitely wasn't a sudden light switch into total moral correctness and clarity. It was an upgrade, but it didn't solve all our problems.
Yeah. So the Enlightenment, we're all children of the Enlightenment, and it's had some wonderful advancements for us, but there are remnants left over that are still really harmful, these ideas of thinking.
So
because racism, even though, race science has been debunked, there's been a lot of anti-racist work going on, but some of those habits in our way of thinking still remain.
So you started down this road to talk about our concept of humanness, right?
Yes. So in the West, that's where our concept of humanness comes in. And then with that ranking, that hierarchy, so you have this ranking of different types of people, and then below that you have other animals, and then below that you have plants. So our relationship with nature is dominating.
Hierarchical, linear, controlling.
Yeah. And we've come to believe that nature is a resource, like it's just part of the material reality that is a resource for us to use. And that goes back to some of the ideas of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, who argued that, Hobbes started off saying that natural man was in a state of war and had to fight for survival and the natural rights to stay alive and to reproduce. And then sovereignty or governance is formed where you have a leader who makes the decisions, and then we form civil society where everyone can behave themselves underneath a sovereign governor. So Locke also talked about, Locke developed the work on property contracts. And he said that you can own property when you mix your sweat with the soil. So this idea of practicing agriculture in the Western way was seen as advanced. And if you didn't practice that, then you didn't have a relationship to the land and you didn't have rights to the land, and then it was okay for colonisers to come in and take it. So in the West, our relationship to land is one of property ownership. That we own land, we control it, and it's a resource for our use. And then if I get into Indigenous epistemologies, Indigenous groups all around the world are different, and they have their own particular cultures and traditions that are localised and are often tightly associated with the land that they live on and the landscape. And everything is connected. So humans are positioned as one of many beings that exist in a big web of interconnected relationships. So there's no hierarchy. Indigenous epistemologies kind of think in circles, whereas in the West we think in a straight line. It's a linear from A to B. We're making progress from being uncivilized to this constant progress to, further civilization, further progress.
Yeah, we're moving up a ladder to increasingly powerful levels or more control.
Yeah. Yeah. So that difference in the way that we see Earth, I think, plays out a lot with the UFO phenomena because we have constructed this idea of human beings as being the most superior on Earth. No other animals have agency, intelligence, or can use reason. And so when we're faced with the thought that there might be another being that is more intelligent than us, we just can't grapple it.
So you're suggesting there that that's a way in which the UFO phenomenon is more challenging to the ontology of like Western colonial mindset than Indigenous people, because the hierarchical problem is much more acute in a world where we're measuring who has the most control. Okay, fascinating.
The idea of control is interesting as well, because we have convinced ourselves that we, like being the most intelligent beings and being the beings that have reason, that we have opportunity to know everything. Do know everything because we're at the top of that ladder. And then I think, so it gets tricky for people to be able to go, I'm whatever professor of physics and there's this thing I don't know. And so they kind of go, no, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, that relates to this point you made earlier about the challenge of embracing ideas that you can't describe or can't know, just like the difference between an ontology that accepts concepts in principle that we can't fully understand versus an ontology that will only engage with concepts that it can describe. That just seems relevant and important here. And I will again express some sympathy for the classical, colonialist view that that we should intuitively be able to describe with this most powerful, beautiful tool we have, language, anything you could imagine, any circumstance you could imagine about the world. I'm a big language fan. My training is in classical theater. I love words, and I deeply feel intuitively that we should be able to describe everything in the universe with our abstract symbols or occasional barks. I don't know if you can hear my agitated husky mix. Maybe he's just chiming in with his ontology.
Exactly.
So I'm curious to hear more about your feelings on these indigenous knowledge systems. I was really struck by this presentation that you shared by a few facts. One was that you mentioned that this group of people that you've been studying are among the oldest cultures in the world, like arguably the oldest continual culture of humans on the planet. And you say at some point you think it's at least 60,000 years. Is that was mind-blowing for me. I didn't know that we had any understanding of any human cultures that went farther than maybe like 10,000 years.
Yeah. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia have really been left out of the conversation. And I often get frustrated when I watch documentaries that kind of talk about the history of human civilization, and Aboriginal people always get forgotten. And in terms of, there's a fantastic book written by an Aboriginal man called Bruce Pascoe, and the book is called Dark Emu. And he argues against the hunter-gatherer label that have been assigned to Aboriginal people in Australia, that they were nomadic and that they'd wander around. And there's lots of archaeological evidence, such as ovens and grinding stones, that Aboriginal people were making bread 15,000 years before the Egyptians were.
Whoa.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of stuff like that. They are incredibly clever people. And despite colonisation, and there was an agenda to wipe Aboriginal people out from Australia, which hasn't happened. Aboriginal people have survived, and they've done their best to hang on to their knowledges. Yeah, but there's some incredible stories, like there's a dreaming story about the rainbow serpent. This is from a community in the north of Australia, and the rainbow serpent vomited in a particular area, and none of the people, especially women, didn't go to that place because they said, if you go there, your children will be born with deformities. And that site now is a uranium site.
Wow. So that sounds like a store of knowledge, like formed in a narrative package, basically passed down probably through generations, maybe without like written language necessarily, but through song and story.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
and also a lot of
ahead.
the stories and the knowledge is held in the landscape. So even though we say it wasn't written down, it was written down in the land, and you just have to know how to read it.
That's a beautiful concept.
Yeah.
So a lot of, as I loosely understand it, their interaction with non-human beings is a pretty common facet of like mythology or narrative within many Indigenous communities. Certainly that's true in America, although those communities are presumably much younger than I think we've been learning some things a little bit that have pushed our time horizons recently about how old Indigenous American populations might be, but they're not 60,000 years old as far as I understand. So maybe the Aboriginal humans are among the oldest or the oldest on the planet. And so it's fascinating to think about that, applying sort of a scientific lens, if it like widens the aperture of potential retained information. If you've got like a couple, say, like visiting beings from other realms of reality or other planets or something, if you add tens of thousands of years to the window in which we could remember successfully encountering such beings, then you could potentially gather more information about it. So that would make those song lines and narratives very interesting for cultural anthropologists. Also, I should just say I learned the word song lines from your work. That's not something I was familiar with, but I just threw it off like I casually said that.
Great. Perfect use of the term.
Thank you. I assumed that meant that there were like songs that are similar across cultures, but they've like diverged in various little pockets over like probably thousands of years.
Not quite.
Okay.
So I'll just go back to, and even though I'm a white Australian, I'm not an Aboriginal or an Indigenous person, so I can't speak for Aboriginal people. I don't feel comfortable explaining their culture. But there is a whole body of work. There's a lot of Indigenous academics that have done really amazing work. So we can draw on that body of knowledge. But a very, very crude translation of a word called Chikirpa, which comes from the Central Desert. So there were over 250 different language groups in Australia. So there's not one group, and they all have their own creation stories. But the word Chikirpa means to dream, and then an early anthropologist translated the meaning into English as the dreaming or the dream time. So dreaming and the dream time are actually separate timelines. The dream time is a creation time that existed before, and that's when everything came into being, when the land was formed. There were ancestral creation spirits who moved across the land and kind of carved the rivers and the mountains, and then so that was the dream time is a very particular time, but the dreaming is an ongoing process of creation. So Caleb, you have your own dreaming. There's Caleb's dreaming. There's Tania's dreaming. There's dolphin dreaming. There's red gum dreaming. There's dreaming for a community and the landscape. A lot of these knowledges as well are also tied to the stars. But the dreaming is about that there's before anything happens in reality, there's a thought. So before we started this interview, you had the idea to invite me along. So there's always a thought before what is actioned in reality.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of the dreaming is that there's a consciousness that precedes everything. And that's ongoing. And then the song lines are songs that where the knowledge is embedded in a song, but the song is related to the landscape. Like that mountain might be a kangaroo lying down or what have you. But a song line there are song lines that crisscross. They're like tracks. They're also called dreaming tracks. Yeah, that crisscross all across Australia. Some go from the east coast to the west coast, all the way across. But the song will travel through different communities and different language groups. But the song can be the same as it travels all the way through. But it will change according to the landscape that changes as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in the songs, there is kind of like the teaching stories that will teach morals and laws, but they also serve as maps. So how you can travel across the country, you follow the song line, and the markers in the landscape and in the stars will show you the way. Yeah. So there is the same cosmology amongst all the different groups in Australia, but they're all connected through song lines, but they do have their own languages and their own cultures, and their knowledges are attached to the landscape, their local landscape.
Another fascinating fact that jumped out at me in your rundown was that they were among the only peoples to focus on the dark parts of the Milky Way when they're looking out into the sky, and to like name regions that didn't have starlight. I thought it was fascinating and beautiful, and I hadn't heard about that before.
Yeah. So going back to Aboriginal people in Australia being the oldest continuing culture, science, like through archaeology, can date that to 60,000 years. But Aboriginal people say they were born here. They were created from the earth here, and they've always been here. And then there are other indicators that they have been here for 200,000 years.
Okay.
So
Actually,
60,000 years is kind of like the minimum that science acknowledges.
felt comfortable proving so far. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And looping back in the juicy topic of UAP, I also noticed in your presentation there were some takes about abduction in some of these narrative traditions. And I was a little confused and dazzled by that part. I wonder if you would care to explain a little bit and lay out more detail.
Well, again, I don't know any more than what was published in that study. So there were two papers published by the same author whose name I'm scared to pronounce.
Okay, sure.
Steve or something.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the researcher captured the stories of an Aboriginal community that was the Warlpiri people, and they have stories about lights. Apparently there is a UFO hotspot in Central Australia, and because it's a remote community, there's often nurses and doctors or teachers or whatever that will live in a remote community for a while and do that work. So when non-Aboriginal people come into the community, the Warlpiri people tell them not to go out at night because you'll get abducted by a UFO. And then they say, but if you stay with me, you'll be safe, you won't get abducted. Because Warlpiri people don't get abducted. They believe that they have been there for so long that they're part of the landscape and that the UFOs recognise them as part of the landscape. They know who they are. But when strangers come in from outside, then they might get abducted. So this is it's really interesting because, and when people get abducted, they don't come back.
Which is not like most of the rest of abduction literature. That's very unusual.
Yeah. And then so there's nobody coming back and reporting the medical interventions or anything like that. They just come back.
They're just gone.
Yeah. At the same time, a lot of Aboriginal stories, like let's say stories they will tell to kids, there'll be like a scary monster. Don't go there because, the devil is going to get you. And it's, there's stories about keeping the children close to the community so they don't wander off and something bad happened to them. So in one way, that story is similar to that the Warlpiri people are saying to the non-Aboriginal people who come into the community, don't wander off because something bad might happen to you, and particularly at night. And it might just be that people get lost in the desert.
Sure.
And they don't come home. So there is that element. But I have a colleague who worked as a remote nurse, a remote area nurse. So she's a nurse and she would live in an Aboriginal community. She'd go back to the same one, but she'd kind of do 3 months on, 3 months off. And, UFOs as lights in the sky is a common and accepted experience for that community. And she told me a story about another nurse. So I know this is kind of secondhand information, but it's a really interesting story. So there was another nurse and they had been out to a job and she was with a driver who was Aboriginal. And they were driving back to the community at night in the desert, and a light came down from the kind of top right-hand side and started coming down and moved around behind them and around them. And the Aboriginal man said to the nurse, do you see that? And she said, yeah. And he said, don't look at it. Don't look at it. And then the UFO came around from the back and then landed on the road in front of them. And he turned the car around and went back the other way, which indicates to me that if you look at the UFO and engage with it, then you how can I say it? Not captured or whatever, but you make that connection. But if you don't look at it, then you can leave. And in the West, like, how many of the, contact stories are exactly like that, where the UFO will come around, it'll land on the road in front of a car, and the people go, oh my God, and they get out and they look at it. So that with that story about only non-Aboriginal people getting abducted in that particular community, it might also be that Aboriginal people know how to behave.
Maybe from a long tradition of experience with exposure to a phenomenon like this.
Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. Don't look at it.
Fascinating. It also reminded me of something another guest said about how people who are trying to avoid getting caught up in the UFO phenomenon just ignore it, and by doing that, they do keep themselves sort of safe from the ontological shock of it. They can not engage, and they don't get sucked into this like world-changing epiphany structure. So there's a rational underpinning to that ignorance, I suppose, in some ways. I'm like you. In fact, I'm much further from this subject. So I feel even less comfortable, really, like trying to probe and investigate Indigenous like ways of knowing that are not mine, and I don't have any right to. So one of the natural questions about this is like, how can we honor and integrate Indigenous insights without appropriating or distorting them? And like, is it reasonable to attempt that project, or is there something kind of like violating by even crossing that line? I don't know. I feel a little bit weird about that question, but I do have it. So there we go.
Good question. Particularly in America, you may know the stories about people, non-Indigenous people, appropriating Native American culture, like wearing the headdresses to Coachella or, whatever else is going on. They've had their land taken.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, they've had their land taken, their children taken, often their language. They're trying to hang on as best they can to their knowledge.
And there have been some bad crossovers, even from people with good intentions who are like trying to do scientific work in Indigenous communities. And there have been people who feel like they were abused or, exploited in those projects for science that didn't end up benefiting them. And this is still like an active area of conflict in American academia anyway. Like sometimes people would like to study these Indigenous peoples more, but they're not necessarily welcome, and it can be a fraught topic. It's very much alive still in 2025. It's a fraught subject.
Yeah. So just back to the appropriation, we can draw on the writings of Indigenous peoples or even their stories, but I'm particularly referring to Indigenous studies as an academic field. So we can draw on that and we can cite their work and make sure that they are credited for being the holders of that information, that knowledge. And I really encourage people to have a look at Indigenous studies as not a way to go, oh, that's an interesting way of thinking, I'll adopt that way of thinking, but as I said before, as the mirror to reflect back on ourselves so that we can start to break down our own ontology about being the superior being, the most intelligent being in a lifeless universe. So we can start to break that down, and then from there we can create something new.
So there's another really interesting idea in this space that maybe fits nicely here about the difference between human versus non-human and human versus like a bigger human or like a larger consciousness, which naturally flows from this like less hierarchical vision of the world where humans are just a part of this bigger picture with other elements of nature, with the landscape itself. And then that expands into like a cosmic connection. So like beings that are connected to each other and to the world and also to the realms that we can't see. And I wonder if you have some deeper thoughts about this and specifically if it interests you because of your interest in the nature of humanity, like what it is to be human. What does it mean to be superhuman or like a higher level of consciousness? And do you think that's useful as a structure to think about the UFO phenomenon or just like in general non-human intelligence that we might encounter or consider?
Well, a term that Indigenous scholars use is more than human. So getting back to the epistemology of the West, the fundamental way that we understand the world is through binaries. That is, the Western logic is always in oppositions. We can see it so clearly, the polarization of different groups in today's society. But also things like, as we were saying before, you've got science, which is true, and then on the other side, you've kind of got culture or marginalised knowledges or the superstitions or whatever.
Yeah.
So
myth.
Yeah, myth. So when you have binary logic, you've got like two options, and one must dominate and subsume the other, which, you know, is kind of a problematic way of thinking and then that also, you know, moves us along this linear line of thinking like, oh, it's this one and it's this one and it's this one. There's a lot of scholarship happening at the moment that talks about moving away from binary logic to trying to expand our way of thinking to incorporate multiplicities. So there's multiple things going on rather than two, and you have to pick one. Which I think is an interesting approach to thinking about the UAP phenomena as well. Because with science, it's like, it's real, it's not real. You know, it has to be one or the other. We can validate it, we can't validate it. And you can see this shift to moving away from binaries. It's happening, you know, with the younger generations and their push on gender norms and saying, you know, there are lots of young people who identify as non-binary or queer or whatever. It's not just male and female. It's not one or the other. There's a spectrum there. There's multiple identities.
I was also thinking about the quantum computing revolution hinging on the concept of superposition.
That is it, yep. So in a traditional computer, you've got ones and zeros, on-off switches. It's either one or it's, you know, it's either on or it's off. Whereas with the quantum computing, it's like multiple threads that come in to a node. Yeah, so that shift is really interesting, and I think that's really, really important for us to get our head around, that we think in binaries. And once you start to notice that, and then we can go, okay, there's multiple things going on. There's a fairly new field of study called posthumanism. Have you heard of that before?
I've heard the word, but I don't have a sense of what people are driving at when they say they're studying it.
So there's a couple of different types of posthumanism. One is often associated with what is more specifically transhumanism, which is the enhancement of humans, like through digital implants.
Or biological upgrades, That one I'm a little more comfortable with. because I've done some like futurism work, and I'm very interested in becoming as transhuman as possible as soon as possible.
Are you?
I tend in that direction, but I'm also a crunchy granola, run my hands through the dirt, talk to my mint leaves kind of guy. So
Awesome.
I feel like I have a foot in both worlds there, but I don't know much about posthumanism. So transhumanism would be one strand of posthumanism, like moving toward a new version of
where
humanity.
The post is like after this version of human that we're in now. But there's another branch of posthumanism, where the humanism is about the theoretical humanist movement.
Okay.
Which kind of came after, that it came after World War II, and the realisation of the damage that comes through racism. And then so there's this idea that we're all humans, we're all part of the same family. But then posthumanism critiques the construction of humanism in the West, because that, even though we're saying, we're all human, we're still this particular type of human that sits atop a hierarchy of all other beings. So posthumanism critiques that. And then says we're not on top of this hierarchy, we're actually embedded in multiple relationships in this much broader world. And then Indigenous scholars have come back and said, we've said that all along, you're colonising villages again. And so that's the tricky part, that non-Indigenous people come up with this great new way of thinking. This is because posthumanism is called a novel way of thinking. But we completely ignore the fact that Indigenous peoples have been saying that all along. So that's,
as long as we're making moral progress, maybe we
appropriation like that.
I guess,
and again, because we think we're right, then our theory is the right one.
Yeah, I to be honest, I have mixed feelings about just the notion of appropriation. I think it's important to be kind and careful and respectful of all cultures. And at the same time, I think it's possible to be sort of overly litigious about that concern, because our mutual appropriation is also like one of the coolest things humans do. It's something, it like goes back since before we were human. Like the classic phrase, monkey see, monkey do, is about the truest thing you could say about our species. We learn by imitation, and we share, we like swap memes, and our like mimetic cultures evolve together and they bounce off of each other. So it's a beautiful thing as well. And that's, that has to live in tension sometimes with just like cultural, political hierarchies and conflicts of their own kinds. But this is pretty far to the side of the UFOs.
I just want to go back. You asked me about the dark spaces in the sky.
I did.
I think I answered that. So I will say Aboriginal people in Australia are the oldest astronomers in the world. And there's a site called Australian Indigenous Astronomy, where there's a lot of scientific papers that match up Aboriginal knowledges with how would you say with the knowledges of astronomy.
What did you say the name of this site?
I think it's Australian Indigenous Astronomy. It's in the reference list of those slides I sent you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so one of the key figures, particularly on the east coast of Australia, is a creation being called Bayami. And Bayami came from the skies, did some stuff on Earth, taught the people laws, how to make tools like the boomerang, and then went back up into the sky and formed the dark patch in the Milky Way, which from the southern skies here looks like an emu.
Oh, okay. Hence dark emu. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's so cool.
I think I just really want to encourage people to go and have a look at this kind of work because it's really interesting. And as I was saying, it challenges the Western ontology and epistemology. Yeah.
So before we move to our next subject, is there anything else you'd like to mention about, like, in specific Indigenous knowledge systems and ways that they could help us engage the UFO phenomenon better than Western science? So here I am, like, comparing binaries again, but like, are there tools you think that we can pick up from this kit that we should all be embracing a little more?
Yeah. So Indigenous peoples have been named and described by the West and by Western research, and particularly anthropologists, through a colonising lens, through that lens that white people are superior. So research for Indigenous communities can be a dirty word. They've been researched and misrepresented through the colonial lens, and then it gets published, and and you were also talking before about marginalised knowledges as well. So their knowledge has been marginalised and considered as myth. But they've written back to that and created their own methodologies for research that is different to Western research, but still rigorous work. And one of the key principles of Indigenous methodologies is to critique Western knowledge. So I think that gives us a really good tool to, again, hold that mirror up and have a look at ourselves. And there are so many problems with trying to study UAP because of the way we conduct research that we can start to look at other methodologies. And I'm not suggesting that we adopt Indigenous methodologies, because we can't conduct Indigenous methodologies if we're not Indigenous people, but we can go to that work and bring it into conversation with our work, to use that as a tool to critique ourselves.
Do you recommend any particular trailheads for folks who are, like me, ignorant of this general field of research?
Yeah, so the big piece of work is by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, and it's called Decolonising Methodologies. Tuhiwai is Tuhiwai. I think that's right. It's also in my list of references.
Cool. I will find it and share it for folks who are interested.
Yeah. So Linda Tuhiwai-Smith is Maori from New Zealand, and her father was a curator in a museum. So she grew up in museums. So she critiques, a lot of the way that, not only the way museums are constructed and the story of human civilization, but also the way that we think and the way that we research. Yeah, so that's a really important pioneering work.
Thank you so much. That's a great place for people to start, including me. And or a place to go next after our deep, searching, hard-hitting interview here. I'm sensitive to your time here, but I'd love to land in more of like a human place. You had mentioned offline that you discovered in the process of getting into UAP that you have had some experiences that you previously hadn't just been able to recognize. So I'm curious about that, and then as a way of moving us toward a landing, I'd also be curious if you have recommendations for how people can hold this ontological maelstrom in their minds, and what they can do to sort of touch earth and stay grounded and sane as they're processing this big project or unfolding update to our ontology. So two big questions there, one about your experience and another about how we can all maintain our own sanity and support each other as we process all this information.
That second question is a big one.
It probably has simple answers like glass of water.
Right now.
Get a nice walk outside now and then.
Yeah.
Maybe I shouldn't have done them both, but
no.
I wanted to get them on the table.
Yeah, it's good. And both those questions link to my personal experience. So as I was saying before, I was always a believer. When I was a kid, Close Encounters of the Third Kind was my favourite movie. I absolutely adored it. And I remember the first time that I saw it, at the end when the craft is there and you're waiting for the greys to come out.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, I remember sitting there the first time I watched it going, what do they look like? What do they look like? What do they look like? And then when they come out, I was like, I knew it. I knew they looked like that. I was right. And I was like about 10 or something. And I'm trying to remember why I felt so certain about what they looked like.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until... So the thing that, flipped the switch for me in terms of realising the phenomena is real was the congressional hearing with Grush.
Mm.
And I first spotted like little shorts that popped up in my YouTube recommended. And I was like, what is this? And there's the spooky movie, the music and the little green alien icon and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, as a trained academic, I was like, what were the questions that were asked? What was the context of this? So I went and watched the whole hearing, and I watched that hearing 3 times in one weekend. And again, the testimonies of particularly like David Fravor, it just like, that's it. Like there's no, I don't think David Fravor's testimony can be contested. Like it's so solid. He's so... And the same with Grush and Ryan Graves. I was so impressed with their impeccable presentation of their knowledge and what was going on. Yeah, so very credible people. And then I spent the whole weekend walking around going, what the? It's all real. It's all real. And I remember going to work on the Monday thinking, and just looking around at all the other people, because I teach, like there'd be a whole classroom full of people and looking around and going, you don't know, I'm living in a different reality to you.
Yeah.
And also looking at people. I asked this in a meeting with the Visible College. I said, when you go to the supermarket, do you look around at all the other people and go, hello, human? Everybody laughed and said, yeah. So you just look at humans in a different way as well. It's like, hey, mate, hey, human.
Yeah, it has a unifying effect.
Yeah, it does have a unifying effect. But then also thinking, you don't, looking at other people and realising that they don't have the whole picture.
Or talking to people who are declining to engage with the subject has been tough for me.
Absolutely. And this is getting back to sociology. So there's a key tool used in sociology, which is that of discourse, of dominant discourse. And so discourse is more than talk or conversation. It's a type of talk that's circulated through society as if it's true. So once upon a time, and there still are in some circles, there was a dominant discourse around race, as I was saying, that white people are the most intelligent and the most moral.
Sure, or in other parts of the world, that like Japanese people versus Chinese people, or
yeah. Or there have been, and I'm drawing on kind of old traditional discourses, but then there are also discourses around gender or, and the discourse, and it's really interesting because we do discourse analysis, and when we do qualitative work and we interview people, and then we might look at the patterns of speech and the things that people are saying and the discourse that's reproduced as if it's truth. And the discourse around this topic, I have never encountered anything so strong. Like it's stronger than the discourses around race or gender, because as soon as you bring it up, you shut down. Mostly with most people, they're just like, there's just some one-liner that people use. It's like, that's crazy. where's the evidence, impossible, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me as a sociologist, seeing that discourse, the power of the discourse around UAPs, I'm like, whoa, it is really, really hard. So I've been working on how I approach it because, after, the grush rush, I went up to a colleague and I said, I'm so excited. UFOs and aliens are real. And she was just like, anyway, it didn't go down well and I felt really embarrassed. So now I have, and I also, because this was a colleague that worked in Indigenous studies, a non-Indigenous person, but because she has that ontological pluralism, I just assumed that she would be able to,
cross that membrane with you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but people don't. So I've been practicing how I approach it, and I really thank Gary Nolan for one tip when he said, when people ask you for evidence, ask them what standard of evidence they would like, because there are different standards of evidence. And so you throw that question back, and it works quite well. So now when I approach colleagues, and I'm not out doing this every day, but when the time's right, I might be having lunch with someone. I'll save the conversation till the very end. So if people aren't interested, we've all got a quick escape. And I'll just say, what do you think of UFOs? And then depending on their reaction, then I'll give them more or I'll back away. But I've had quite a lot of colleagues who have been quite interested, and then I've shown them the Visible College website and they've said, oh, that's cool, that looks like fun, but they haven't they haven't kind of fallen into that, oh my God, this is amazing, we need to look at this further. So that's been quite interesting, and I've had one colleague who has done that and gone, oh my God, and it's dived down the rabbit hole and is asking me for more information and all that. So yes,
it is a part of the project. I kind of want to avoid it sometimes. The triptych for me is get other people to recognize that this is an interesting subject, learn more about what the heck is going on, and then process collectively that discovery, those discoveries, these ontological updates. And that third one is kind of squishy because, I don't know, get used to it. Like, what am I talking about? Just like that one, it's like psychological and on some grand scale civilizational. How do we get used to this idea? And there will be like practical steps. If this stuff is real, we should do scientific outward. There might be diplomacy eventually, there might be like structures we have to build academically, militarily, diplomatically, yada, yada. But I tend to breeze past the first one of getting people involved because it's just such a hassle. And it's really hard to turn the lights on for somebody else. But I do think we have to do it. And because it enables those other two steps. Like we have to, more people being involved and being curious will then lead to more funding for better science, which then will help us get to processing and taking action as a group. So as uncomfortable as it is, we have to keep having these conversations and expanding our horizon. And sometimes in reaching out to academics, this is one of the reasons I congratulated and thanked you at the beginning. I have had people say, look, I'm interested in it, but I'm not ready to talk about it publicly. And I'm thinking, well, if you, a person who like works at the Galileo Project or something, aren't willing to put your face on the subject, then how the hell are we going to get more science funding or like convince other people that there's actually something here? Like you're never gonna, we talk about the stigma a lot, but people don't propose plans for how to erode it. Sorry, I got a little bit overactivated there.
Okay.
But thank you for having those conversations. And it's nice to know that you're reaching out to other academics.
Yes. And friends as well, at this point, I'll get back to that, but at this point I will say that I don't think disclosure is going to come from the top. I don't think it's going to come. There's going to be some announcement where the President of the United States says, hey, aliens and UFOs are real. I think it will come from the people. I think it will from a slow consciousness raising, that one by one we will all make that change. And when I first joined the Visible College, and again after that grush rush, I was so worried about, oh my God, all of humanity is going to go into ontological shock at the same time and everything's going to collapse and it's so bad. All that. But now I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think there's a small drip, like each one teach one very slowly, and then we'll reach a critical mass at some stage. But getting back to my personal experience, so then there was the grush rush. And after that, one of Stephen Brown's videos popped up in my recommended, and I watched that and I was like, oh, another, because I was feeling so alone. Oh my God, there's another academic. And so I emailed Stephen, and that was around the time that he was just pulling the Visible College together. At that time, we were still under the umbrella of the New Paradigm Institute.
He had a similar effect for me. I felt very calmed by his sane approach, and he was my first guest on this podcast as a result.
Oh, really? I'll have to go back and watch it. Yeah, and then diving into the rabbit hole, there was some things that started triggering a memory for me that when I was a child, I used to imagine small greys standing alongside my bed. There were 4, 2 on either side. Wow. And then my bed, I remember my bed kind of elevating, like rising up to the size of a table. And then it was like, that stainless steel kind of medical table.
Wow.
But I remember feeling confused because even though my bed rose up, the greys were the same size. And I remember always feeling confused about that.
Okay.
But it was always in my imagination. I never, ever thought that they were really in my room. I just thought that it was some kind of kid's imagination. And then down the rabbit hole, I started seeing, hearing other people's stories who have had contact experiences, and like Whitley Strieber and some of some other drawings that people have done about their experiences. So when I had this experience, there was a thing that came down from the ceiling, and it was like, not like a lampshade. I never thought of it like a lampshade, but it was like an upside down glass bowl with a very particular shape on a cord. And I remember looking up, and the ceiling, everything was just black, and then this thing came down, and as it was coming down, I remember thinking, what's that? What's that weird thing? And then I went, oh, it's the cone of silence from Maxwell Smart. Do you remember that?
No.
People of my generation will know what I'm talking about. But in Maxwell Smart, it was like a comedy spy thing. And when Maxwell Smart and his boss spoke in their office, there would be this clear plastic thing come down and kind of cover both of them, and then they could talk inside it and nobody outside could hear them.
Okay.
So I remember going, oh, that's the cone of silence. And then it come down and covered my whole body. But after reading Diana Pasulka, and she talks about, the fine line between media and our memories and how the media can influence our memories. And then I kind of went, oh, well, it was the opposite for me. Like I couldn't figure out what that thing was, so I applied something that I knew from television to make sense of it. But it was when I started to kind of like pull those pieces together, then I kind of went, okay, well, that matches up with other people's experiences.
Yeah.
Maybe that was real.
Wow.
And so that was a little bit weird.
Yeah.
So I wasn't kind of expecting that. And also because always, as a child, it was always imagination, always in my imagination.
But these were conscious memories as a kid, where you were waking up and remembering this, or did you
when I was falling asleep.
Okay.
Yeah, they'd come. And I was never scared of them. I was excited to see them, but I always thought it was imagined.
Did you talk to other people about it at the time? Like, did you tell your parents that you were having these experiences?
Never
Or
told anybody. Never told anybody.
wow,
But I do remember asking my friends when I was a kid. I asked my friends if they ever felt out of sync with time.
huh? Interesting.
And I remember getting this feeling like being dizzy. It kind of faded when I think the last time I remember feeling it, I might have been like 18, 19. But it was like like getting dizzy. But when you get dizzy, it's all in your head. This was like a weird kind of warbling of time.
Huh.
And it would just be a few seconds. And I remember, like, when I was thinking, okay, if that experience was real, and then I remembered you used to ask people if they ever felt out of sync with time. And then I was trying to remember the feeling. And I was like, well, it doesn't matter if you can't remember that feeling. You asked people if they felt out of sync with time.
Yeah, that's a fact about your life.
Yeah, so trying to fit all those things in. And also, there's a really interesting relationship between the UAP, and nuclear facilities and weapons and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it interesting that John Mack he protested against nuclear testing before he was into UAPs. Whitley Strieber wrote a book before, he came out with his experience. He wrote a book about climate change. And in my early 20s, I used to work for Greenpeace Australia. And I was a dedicated greenie or environmentalist.
Nice.
And I had a dream one night where I was in a room and the ceiling and the floor was flat, but the walls were curved. I don't ever remember seeing the other people that were in that room, but it was like we just finished a meeting. You know, when you finish a really good meeting that's been productive and you're like, yeah, all right, let's go. I know what to do. We have a plan. I had that kind of feeling. And then I looked at the wall and part of the wall just turned into a window, like this rectangle window. And I saw out the window the little Earth like this, and I realised I was in space and Earth was out there. And then I was like, oh, how do I get home? And again, I wasn't quite scared, but it was like, oh, how do I get home? And then someone in the room pointed to the floor, and there were symbols on the floor. And the one they pointed to was a circle with a cross inside it. So, like a circle cut into 4 quarters. Stepped on it and it opened up like a valve. And I got sucked into this tube that was like blue and twirling, and it like going down a water slide, but it was all like blue twirling light. And that was the end of the dream. And then I went to work that day. And we had a guest speaker come from, he was talking about urban planning and greening urban spaces. And during his presentation, up comes this slide, and there is a circle with a cross on it. And I saw it straight away. And he said, this is the ancient symbol for Earth.
Whoa, cool.
And at the time, I always thought, oh, that's about the environment. That's about my work, saving the planet. And then, when I got into this space, I kind of went, hang on, maybe that wasn't a dream. Maybe that was also a real experience or a telepathic experience or something like that. And I told Janice Whitlock about it. Ooh. And when I got to the point about being sucked into this tube, she said to me, oh, you went through a portal. And I was like, oh, it was a portal. Okay.
Wow. That's interesting. I forgot that you guys were friends, but when I mentioned that person earlier who said if you look at the UFO subject, you kind of get drawn into it. That was Dr. Whitlock's point about it, and she was making the observation that some people avoid looking at it to avoid getting sucked through that portal up into these interesting spaces, and partly she was coming at it from a psi-friendly vision that you can, if you engage with these phenomena, you might be more likely to have deeper experiences with them. And there are, lots of people who have psychic experiences young say they go through a phase where they really blocked it out and they turned it off. So it seems at least like it's possible that if these psi phenomena are real, that there's such a thing as being open to them or being closed off from them. And you also mentioned to me offline that you felt your mom had some serious psi connections, even though she didn't identify as a psychic professionally.
Yeah. So I grew up with my mum doing things. Well, my favorite example, and this is, one thing that happened with me, is that I lived interstate, and I'd come back home to visit mum, and she was taking me back to the airport. On the way, we stopped and had lunch. And after lunch, we were just sitting there, and she said to me, because I had a friend house sitting my house and looking after my dog, and she said to me, "Oh, you ought to message your friend who's looking after your house and just ask them to leave some milk in the fridge because you'll love a cup of tea when you get home." And I said, okay. So I picked up my phone to message Colin, and as it's in my hand, a message comes from Colin, and it says, "I'm leaving the house now. I've left you a little bit of milk in the fridge because you'll love a cup of tea when you get home."
Wow. Cool.
I turned around, showed my mum, she just laughs. "Oh, that's funny." So, and she did things like that all the time. So I think that has really helped me, like with my ontological shock and getting down to like landing on consciousness, that I already had an understanding that there is something more than, physical material reality. So it's made some of the weirder side stuff easier for me to digest. And also the dreams, it's a thing in our family that will quite often have prophetic or precognitive dreams, like the one and there'll just be something simple in the day that will go, that was in the dream. Even once I had a dream, I'd woken up in the morning seeing a pimple burst and all the pus came out, right? That was all it was. And then I make a cup of tea and I'm sitting outside on the back step with my dog, and my dog rolls over for a belly scratch. She's got this big pimple on her belly, and I just touched the skin next to the pimple when it burst. I was like, I just saw that in my dream, you know? Really simple things, but it kind of has always kind of said to me that I'm on the right track or I'm on the right path. And then so with that dream, where I'm pretty convinced I was on a UFO and I was given information like a plan, I always thought that was about the environment. But then when I joined the Visible College, it was like, it's about this, this is the time now, whatever the plan I was given, it's unfolding now. And there's a lot of other people in the Visible College who felt the same as well, who kind of had something or felt like there was some calling or a draw or some synchronicities that things were set up, and then they've landed in this space.
Well, maybe to modify my earlier question about what you recommend for people processing these things, we could incorporate some of those psi phenomena or synchronicities and just ask, do you have some advice for people? I would imagine there's some folks listening to this who might be experiencing some things like that in their life and wondering whether to open themselves up more or ignore this stuff or shut it down. And I wonder if you have any advice for folks going through things like that.
Yeah. Well, I recommend a dive down the rabbit hole. It was awesome. It's confronting and it's overwhelming. But I think on the other side of it, I just feel kind of more confident in what reality is, and that it's much more complex. The universe is much weirder
Yeah.
than we possibly imagine. Yeah. So advice for people, I don't know. People in the visible college just kind of seem to eventually land on this place of consciousness, and then you start to settle. Or sometimes there's like a trigger that will, unbalance or rattle your ontology, and then you settle, and then there's something else and flip, and eventually you'll get down to the consciousness stuff. Just hang in there. I'd say go for the dive, hang in there, hang out with like-minded people, because that really, really helped me. Yeah, joining the Visible College and being amongst, just to be able to have these conversations with people. You get that reassurance that you're not insane, that other people are experiencing the same thing. Yeah. And then little things, like finding out about those little things that I saw in my experience, and then going, oh, I remember that.
Yeah. Maybe many people have these little nuggets of their past waiting to be unlocked or appreciated in a new light.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything you'd like to touch that we haven't covered today? We went a little bit long, but I really appreciate your time. It was a fun conversation. Is there anything lingering that you wanted to address or tie up or fix?
I think one other thing that I'd just like to mention, along with the post-human literature, which critiques the construction of the meaning of humanness in the West, there's also a body of work around speciesism that kind of does the same thing, but it talks about that separation, like that line that's drawn between humans and other living beings. Humans are the only ones that have agency and reason and intellect, and that no other animal on earth or no other creature has that. And that's the difference with Indigenous epistemologies, is that everything is conscious. Everything, rocks, trees,
rivers,
sunset,
rainstorms.
Yeah, everything has consciousness. Everything has agency, and everything holds knowledge. Whereas in the West, humans are the only one that holds knowledge. So breaking down that idea as well of us being a superior species and how we relate to other species, I think is an interesting avenue for exploration when we come to meet whatever beings, that are kind of teasing us, popping in and out of our reality.
Yeah, and even if we go on to invent AI that's smarter than us, we're going to need some kind of non-hierarchical framework to make an argument for why we're valuable in the ecosystem.
And that we're a small part of a much larger system, much larger consciousness. So there's the more than human world, as Indigenous people would say, and then humans are a small part of that. Which I like, rather than, I said, like that binary logic of being human or non-human.
Human within a more than human world.
Yeah.
Well, this has been super fascinating and eye-opening and mind-expanding for me. I really appreciate you taking the time. I hope you had fun chatting.
I did. I wasn't expecting us to chat for so long.
Thank you. Yeah, I felt like the river just carried us along, and it certainly felt worth doing to me. So I appreciate you indulging with the extra time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I was apprehensive, but then I was like, I just couldn't imagine myself saying no. So
yeah, life is calling on us. Aw, thank you. Bravo. Is there a place where you like people to engage with your work or follow you online, or?
Yeah, I'm not really on social media.
Yeah.
Oh, and the last thing, I have stepped back from the Visible College and, being obsessed with the UAP issue, because, every night I'd be watching YouTube videos one after the other, and now I catch up once a week.
Nice.
So
Probably
it's
better
also,
for your sanity.
if you want to step back, that's okay as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good advice too.
It's overwhelming. Yeah.
Just check in with this podcast once a week and that'll be plenty.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Searle,
for inviting me. I'm very honoured, and especially with the calibre of interviewees you've had on your channel. I feel very special. Thank you.
I'm very lucky to have had you join us. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
And that's the show. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening or watching. If you like WTUFO and you want it to keep existing, support us at patreon.com/WTUFO or on YouTube or on Buzzsprout for as little as you want per month. Patreon or YouTube or Buzzsprout, this show is brought to you by you. So thank you very much for your support. I hope you keep listening, and I hope you have a lovely day.